and can answer any questions you might have about them. Okay, well, thank you all very much for being here today. Thank you to the Bayliss Society for inviting me. I'm Monica Lawton, and by way of background, I started out in life with a degree in history. I've always loved history. Went on to work at the Science Museum, go figure, but my career was mostly in nonprofit and association management in the construction and legal arena. But when I retired, I was able to become a docent at the Cape Ann Museum, which I absolutely love, and it has provided an opportunity to delve back into history in all of its different aspects here on Cape Ann. I've lived here for 25 years, and I might have a special interest in the granite industry because my house has a nice big quarry motion in it, complete with the feathers and the wedges, still in place. You try to plant a garden and you have to dig up all the grout that was left behind by the quarrying, etc. And my house was built by the Swedish quarry workers who came to the area in Pigeon Cove. So, and I also, with Phil Schwartz, lead the Cape Ann Sunday morning hikes, following in the footsteps of Ted Tarr, who did it for so many years. And in the course of the hikes, we have been through all of the lands, the woodlands and the quarry lands of all over Cape Ann. So that's who I am. And I want to thank Ed for his amazingly brief overview of hundreds of millions of years of the geologic history. And so now we are going to drill down a little bit, no pun intended, to talk about the 100-year period when that granite underground was big business here on Cape Ann. 20 minutes, we really can't cover any more than the highlights. So if this whets your appetite and you'd like to know more, I would encourage you to look for these three books, which served as the primary basis for this talk. First and foremost of all, Hammers on Stone by Barbara Urkela, who was a journalist and a real authority on the granite industry, and this really takes a deep dive into the subject. I found the answer to your questions about Buttmans, and it's marked on the page below, and you can read that page if you'd like. So, and then, of course, we have a newer book by Paul St. Germain called Cape Ann Granite, and this is the story in pictures. Photographs. Most of the photographs in both books came either from the Sandy Bay Historical Society collection or from the Cape Ann Museum collection. And this is a wonderful read. And then if you really want the Reader's Digest version, you would look at Mark Carlotto's book, which does a very nice job of talking about the quarrying that came into Cape Ann as Dogtown and settlements were dying out in the southern part of the island woods. So, and there are many other resources as well, but I want to give credit where credit is due, and everything you hear today mostly came from those books. So I'd like to give you a quick sense of how quarrying got started, where the major quarries were, what they produced, where it went, who did the work, and then what happened and why did it all come to an end. Now, I know this is a conference focusing on Gloucester, but we cannot talk about quarrying on Cape Ann without talking about Rockport, because that is where it all began. Of course, when it began, Rockport was still part of Gloucester, the village of Sandy Bay. Got started around 1800 when stone was needed for a fort in Castle Island. Got a little bit of a boost in 1813 and 1113 when they built the Salem jail. And most of the stone for the Salem jail came out of the pit behind the Pigeon Cove Chapel. And of course, that jail is still there today. It now houses residents of a different sort in the form of condominiums and a restaurant, etc. So it's a wonderful building to see. The quarrying really started right along the shore because it was right there, right next to the road. You can carve it out, get it to the wharfs, onto the ship. That was the easiest thing to do. It was near at hand. And so the quarrying worked its way up the shore in Rockport and a little bit inland. Many of you are probably familiar with the granite pier that sticks out into Sandy Bay and Rockport. On the other side of the granite pier inland is Flatledge Quarry. And that was the first major quarry operation on Cape Ann. And it had the first contract for paving stones. It had the first derrick in the 1830s. The granite pier itself was built in the 1830s, and eventually there was a quarry railroad up there as well. And some of these photos here, you can refer to them a little bit later. We have Flatledge Quarry. We have this major engineering feat, a stone arched bridge. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But Flatledge was a very important starting point for the quarrying industry here on Cape Ann. So other quarries quickly followed, which brought some prosperity to the village of Sandy Bay. So in 1840, they had the confidence to break away from Gloucester and form their own independent community. And they thought about calling it East Gloucester or Granite or some other name, but they settled upon Rockport. So 1840, the town of Rockport formed. And there were some Rockport businessmen, name of Benaiah Colburn and William Torrey, who started crossing the new border onto the Gloucester side and taking up operations in the Hodgkins Cove, in the Bayview area. And from there, from Bayview, the quarrying spread north into Lanesville, Folly Cove, around to the Babson Farms quarry at Halibut Point, ultimately covering the entirety of the northern part of the island here. Eventually, there were more than 60 significant quarries, 15 major ones, and then the rest were of a smaller nature called motions. Some of the motions were so small they really just were worked by one or two men cutting out paving stones in their spare time. We have no idea where that word motion came from. That's always the first question that comes up. I haven't heard a reliable explanation for motion, but that's what they're called. And now some of these quarries, I'm sure you'll recognize the names. The names changed a lot, in a lot of cases over the course of time, and many of them are pictured over here as well. We mentioned Flatledge, Steel Derrick. You've probably heard of Steel Derrick, which has been was featured in Coda and other movies as well, named for the 100-foot steel derrick that was put in just after 1900. We have a picture of that over here as well. The Big Parker and Little Parker pits in Rockport. The Little Parker is owned by the town in conjunction with Greenbelt, and it is open to the public and is a nice swimming hole. I mentioned the Babson Farms Quarry, another big one. Johnson's Quarry was one of the last ones in operation in Rockport. And although small operations continue there to this day, the major operations there shut down in the 1950s, is my understanding. In Bayview and Lanesville, Old Pit was the Klondike Reservoir. We have a picture of that over here in the middle here. And that was a big one. And Torrey's Pit, Vernon's Pit, Blood Ledge. Blood Ledge was the biggest one of all. I believe it was somewhere around a mile across, 225 feet deep. Huge quarry. Devil's Pit, and here's one, the William, is it Chevs or Cheeves? Some of you might know. Rebecca thinks it's Cheeves. I have no idea. But Mr. William, Chevs or Cheeves, is standing over here taking an order for stone from the Cheeves Green Granite Quarry. Blood Ledge and Cheeves quarries both had this unusual sea green, olive green granite, which you can see today in the base of the Joan of Arc statue over there at the Legion Square junction of Main Street and Washington Street. I look at it, I don't see green, but they say it's green, so okay. Also, apparently, it was used, the green granite, for much of the dog bar construction as well. So if you take a walk out there, you can take a look and see if you think it's green. So Buttman's Pit and Kenny's Pit, side by side. We saw one of them today, and those, of course, were the source of the Lanes Cove breakwater that we saw, which was built, by the way, in the 1840s. And later became the summer home of Paul Manship, and I think you all know it is now the site of the Mars program, Manship Artist Residency. The Barker Pits, which is now part of the Kleimola Reservation, and I understand that's the correct pronunciation. We learned that this morning. And the Bay State Quarry, which is not too far from the Barker Reservoir that we saw this morning. Bay State Quarry, also I think today might be known as Bianchini's Pit. It's at the end of Bianchini Road. That was a big one. We'll be talking a little bit more about that later. Some of you heard me say this morning that was the first quarry to hire Finns to work in the quarries. Over the decades, there was an ever-changing succession of owners and partners, forming partnerships, dissolving partnerships, teaming up and splitting, the quarries going from one merged company to another. It literally makes your head spin, and I can't possibly keep track of all the chains of change there, but Barbara Urkula does a good job of explaining it all. But there are a few companies that stand out and are worth talking about just a little bit. I mentioned the Barker brothers. They were up here in Lanesville. They had several pits in the area we walked around today, and they were in business from 1852 to 1906, so they had a pretty long run. The Cape Ann Granite Company. This one's a really interesting one, and it was located in Bayview, in the Hodgkins Cove area. Now, this one, the Cape Ann Granite Company was formed in 1867 by Colonel Jonas French. Colonel Jonas French is in this picture over here, which we'll talk about. And he was an aide to General Benjamin Butler. Who's heard of General Benjamin Butler? Few hands, okay, that's good to know. General Benjamin Butler was probably one of the most inept Union generals of the Civil War. Lincoln seemed to like him, but eventually he was relieved of command by Ulysses S. Grant. And he was much better as a lawyer, entrepreneur, and a politician. Well, he was from Lowell, but somehow found his way to Gloucester, where he liked it very much and decided to build himself a granite house in Bayview, which he named Bayview because he liked the magnificent view across Ipswich Bay. So Butler named it Bayview and took an interest in the quarrying business when he was building his house. But he didn't go into quarrying himself. He persuaded Jonas French to go into quarrying. So French bought Blood Ledge, and which was the, quote, the most awesome on Cape Ann. And French was a progressive guy. He wanted all the latest tools. He wanted the quarry railroads. He was the first to build a quarry railroad that went from Hodgkins Cove up to his quarries, the old pit, the Klondike, and the quarries up in that area. He put that in 1870. That was Polyphemus 1. I don't have a photo of Polyphemus 1, but 9 years later, he put in Polyphemus 2, and he had them going in two different directions up there. He was, as I said, very progressive, and he kept those quarries going until around 1892, when he happened to be sitting on the board of a bank, and the bank crashed, I guess, and he was indicted for embezzlement of the bank. So he lost his business. Cape Ann Granite Company went kaput. Well, he wasn't down and out for long. He came back to form another company a year or so later, and then lo and behold, the Bay State Quarry becomes available. Well, when his Cape Ann Granite Company went out of business, Rockport Granite Company bought it up, and there was no longer a Cape Ann Granite Company. But Jonas French, 2 years later, he snatches up the Bay State Quarry, reorganizes it as the Cape Ann Granite Company once again. And again, he wants to be just as progressive there as he was down a little bit further to the south. So the Bay State Quarry had already started a quarry railroad, had started putting it in along what we now know as the tracks that lead from Pine Pit in Rockport in a straight run out to Bay State Quarry. And we could have taken a nice little shortcut this morning to get over there to Bay State and the tracks, but we didn't have time to do that. So he put in a quarry railroad. He bought another engine, which he named for his wife, Nella. And here you have Nella, not at Bay State Quarry, but at Flatledge, because they moved them around. Wherever they needed an engine, they would just put it on a barge, ferry it around the island, and there it is at Flatledge Quarry. So he was at Bay State for a few years, but by 1903, he was out of business, and his company was taken over by another company. They were out of business by 1908, and following this, there's a succession of other companies. During World War II, the quarries were idle, and then I guess in the 50s, the Bianchinis bought Bay State Quarry and resumed operations, providing riprap for seawalls and breakwaters and things of that sort. On the Rockport side, you had the Pigeon Hill Granite Company, which owned Steel Derrick and Parker's Pits, and had an incline railroad that went down to a wharf right next to the granite pier. And I like to mention this because they had an engine house down there, to power the derricks and such. That engine house still exists. It is a private residence. And should you be in the mood to live by the water, you may wish to consider purchasing the engine house for $5 million plus today. It's quite a remarkable place, actually. A little too close to the water for me. Okay, now we have to talk about the Rockport Granite Company, which was formed in 1864, really out of the ashes of a lot of other companies that had worked Flatledge and surrounding areas, going back to the 1830s. Right from the start, they started buying up all the other smaller companies, both in Rockport and Bayview and Lanesville, including the Cape Ann Granite Company in 1893, the Lanesville Granite Company, which had owned Buttman's and Kenny's. They bought up the Babson Farm Quarry, and finally the Pigeon Hill Granite Company. So they bought them all sooner or later. They had letterhead that said, Rockport Granite Company is the king of rocks. So they had 300 acres in Rockport, 300 acres in Gloucester, and I like to talk about what is arguably their most amazing engineering feat, which is this stone arch bridge. Have you all had a chance to visit the stone arch bridge? Oh, well, you really, if you haven't been there, this stone arch, Keystone Bridge, is at Flatledge. It's a piece of Route 127, a Granite Street, over by the Granite Pier. And it was built in 1872 to provide a tunnel for Nella to come straight from the quarry to the Granite Pier without having to stop for traffic to pass along the street. It took them 11 weeks to build this stone arch of the bridge, although it did take them 4 years to blast away the rock underneath to make the tunnel. But it was really quite an amazing feat. So today, if you park over by the Granite Pier, you can walk under the Stone Arch Bridge and walk a little further to Flatledge Quarry, where you can see sometimes, if the water's low, you can see the tracks that go into the water, and it's a nice walk. It's very pleasant over there. Okay. Now, these companies specialized in certain types of stone, but taken all together, they did it all. And I saw an advertisement for the type of stones that the one company had available. I couldn't find that advertisement to make a photo of it, but I know they did foundation stone, customized dimension stone, building stone, monument stone, memorial stones, grave stones, edge stones, curving stones, riprap stones, stone chips, stone dust. As one, and of course, paving stones. Can't forget the big one, paving stones. One company executive said, "We sold everything except the noise." So, Cape Ann granite, you may know this, was shipped to cities up and down the Atlantic seaport, to the Midwest, down to New Orleans and Houston, across to Cuba, around Cape Horn, to Chile, to San Francisco. Really quite amazing. The biggest use, of course, paving stones. And during the heyday, second half of the 19th century, millions and millions of paving stones left Cape Ann, going to New York, Philadelphia, you name the city. They probably had Cape Ann granite. At one point in time, there were more than 32 different sizes of paving blocks, each customized to the city that ordered it. And the Cape Ann Granite Company in 1874 had a contract for 5.5 million paving blocks for the city of Boston alone. And when quarrying first started, people had some fear that they might run out of granite here on Cape Ann. You know, they were really concerned, might run out. But it didn't take them long to realize it went a little deeper than everybody realized. And in 1839, the Gloucester Telegraph, I guess the predecessor to the GDT, wrote with confidence, "There is probably stone enough to supply the whole of the United States with building material for several centuries." And they did indeed do that. Cape Ann granite was really in demand. Ed Becker alluded to it. It was very high quality granite, fine-grained, extremely hard, considered by many to be the best quality of all. And so it went to everywhere, really, for big institutional buildings. Banks, post offices, courthouses, city halls, libraries, churches, etc. Buildings that were built to last forever. And Charles Rogers, who was an executive with Rockport Granite, once said, "When the end of the world comes, all concrete will be reduced to sludge, but Cape Ann granite would be standing still in perfect condition." And he's probably right. And you've probably heard about some of the projects that came out of Cape Ann, just to name a few of the more local ones: parts of the Longfellow Bridge, the Custom House Tower, the entrance to the Holland Tunnel, portions of the Brooklyn Bridge, banks and buildings in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. The U.S. Naval Academy dorms were built at Annapolis. It came out of Johnson's Quarry. The U.S. Navy dry dock in Norfolk, Virginia, which is the oldest operating dry dock in the country, also came from Cape Ann. We could go on and on and on. We really could, and we don't have time. Locally, you probably know the Gloucester Post Office is Cape Ann granite. St. Anne's Church is a beautiful building, 1876, and that was built of granite because at the time, brick was too expensive. So we really can't finish the story of what they did, though, without mentioning two of the projects that have special significance, the big infrastructure ones. One of them, of course, is the dog bar, which we have pictured over here with a lovely lady sitting in her best Sunday dress, enjoying the scene. That was built, as we said, from the Cheves Green Granite Company, for the most part, back in 1894, over the course of 11 years, finished around 1905. And during the course of the construction, no fewer than 39 ships went aground on this breakwater under construction and got wrecked because it was an uncharted reef. But they finished it, and today it's a wonderful place to walk and enjoy the Schooner Festival, etc. And then the other one is the Sandy Bay National Harbor of Refuge. How many of you are familiar with that? Oh, a few hands go up. This is the most amazing story. I had never heard it until I moved up to Cape Ann. We have a photo here. There are much better ones, really, of a gentleman standing on this breakwater. If you go to the end of Bearskin Neck and Rockport and you look off into the distance, you see this on the horizon, a strip of rocks. Well, back in 1885, the political leaders of Cape Ann, or in Rockport, somehow convinced Congress that what was needed was 1.5 miles breakwater off the coast of Rockport to provide safe harbor for the Navy's fleet. And the idea was it would provide safety for up to 5,500 sailing vessels, rivaling the Harbor of Refuge in Cherbourg, France. And so for almost the course of 30 years, Congress poured money into this project. The U.S. Navy sent their North Atlantic fleet up to Sandy Bay every summer during the 1890s and into the early 1900s, and they would conduct war games with their battleships and destroyers offshore. 5,000 sailors would descend upon Cape Ann to enjoy summer by the sea. But finally, in 1915, they realized this project is going nowhere fast. Not much of it had been built. The cost had gone up by millions, so Congress pulled the plug. But the breakwater still sits out there, and tourists ask about it. And it is a navigational hazard, but at least now it's on the charts. So you don't run aground. Okay, just switching gears, we're coming down towards the end here. As beneficial as quarrying was to the economy, it was, as you know, hard and dirty work, and it wasn't easy either on the landscape or the people doing the work. So as you look at all these pictures, it's basically a moonscape around all of these quarries. There's not a blade of vegetation to be seen anywhere. The work was hard manual labor, using at first a variety of hand tools, the hammers, the wedges, to cut these massive stone blocks from the quarry ledges and break it down to the size stones that are needed. But by the end of the century, technology progressed, and you began by the 1860s to see air compressor drills, air-powered drills, and later by the 1880s you had steam drills and steam-driven pumps and steam to run the steel derricks, etc. So they took advantage of that technology when they could. Those steel derricks with their steam-powered engines, etc., they could lift 100 tons of stone, and that's pretty amazing to think about, really. At first, they did use oxen to haul the stone down to the wharfs on these huge, overbuilt, oversized wagons, and that's what you're seeing in this picture over here. I mentioned it's Colonel Jonas French. And there's an 18-foot slab of granite here. There are 15 yoke of oxen hauling this. And they were in Bayview, hauling it from Bayview to downtown Gloucester. It took them 3 weeks to do this. It was destined for the First Baptist Church as one of the outside steps. But ultimately, it is now at the base of the path leading to the Fitzhenry Lane house. And then down at the wharfs, the stone would be loaded into boats. Many of them were sloops, the stone sloops. Some were schooners and later steam-driven boats as well. The Albert Baldwin was one of the most famous of these because it continued to operate for many years with one captain, never had an accident. The Albert Baldwin is in this picture of Lanesville. This is a great picture of Lanes Cove Harbor, and the Albert Baldwin sloop is off to the left here. I didn't recognize the name of this other vessel over here, but and you can see a derrick here to load onto the boat. Those boats, they were dangerous because they would sit so low, heavily laden with stone, they'd be barely above water, and if they got into any kind of rough weather, they'd go straight to the bottom. So they were very dangerous. No insurance company would go near them. They were not insured at all. So the Albert Baldwin was, which was owned by Jonas French. You know, he just was into everything, really, and always had the finest of everything. So, okay, the workers. Quarrying was big business and needed a lot of workers to keep up with the growing demand in the second half of the 19th century. So it began to attract immigrants who saw opportunity and weren't put off by the hard and dirty work and the very low pay. So first you had the Irish, and they settled everywhere. Rockport, Lanesville, Bayview, etc., caused a little bit of a furor because that always seems to be what happens when immigrants move in. But they settled in, built a church, First Catholic Church in Rockport in the 1850s, and also in Gloucester. In Gloucester, their church became St. Anne's, which we said was built in 1876. The first Finns arrived here in the 1870s, settling in Lanesville, as I'm sure you all know. And oftentimes, and as I mentioned earlier, hired first by Bay State Bay State Quarry was the first place that they found work. Oftentimes, single men lived in boarding houses for maybe $3.50 a week. And many of them partied hard on Saturday nights, and people didn't like that too much. And many eventually moved on to other jobs or other places, but many settled and brought in their families and began to continue life and the customs of the old country. And you all know this better than I do. They built saunas, established social clubs, the Wainola Hall. Is that the right pronunciation, Wainola? Wainola. Wainola, okay, yep. They formed a socialist society because they're very politically minded and active, and a music band, the Waino Band. Is that the correct? Okay. And forming churches, and I think you know they eventually acquired the church that's now St. Paul's Lutheran. Other Scandinavians arrived in the 1880s, 90s, the Swedish, and they settled primarily in the Pigeon Cove area along Stockholm Avenue, for example, a good name, Curtis Street, Story Street, which, as I said earlier, is where I live, and they built my house, and they left all the granite grout behind for me to have to dig out of my garden. So quarrying gave them a good start, but for many it did not end well, as I think you also know. Between 1870 and 1930, death records show 86% of quarry workers died from lung disease or stone cutters consumption, which was TB or silicosis or something along those lines, as a result of exposure to the stone dust. And it really wasn't until the end of the century that there were some measures put into place to begin to control the dust. I read that they started to do some form of vacuuming to suck up the dust, but I'm not sure it was very effective. So the industry thrived for just about 100 years, from 1820, or really 1830, it really got going, until 1930, eventually done in by concrete and steel for buildings, asphalt for roads, and by labor strikes too. For shorter hours and better pay. There were big labor strikes, and the Finns in particular did not hesitate to get involved in those labor organizing activities. So big strikes in the 1890s, in the teens, and in the 20s, and did achieve some small improvements, but also put more stress on these companies because by this time their markets were eroding and business was declining. So by the 1920s, the Rockport Granite Company was really the last company standing, and the workers went out on strike just before the stock market crash in 1929. So it really was no surprise when, in 1930, they closed their doors suddenly, never to reopen. To us, it's no surprise. Apparently, it was still a shock then, and several hundred people were put out of work at that time. And that was the proverbial nail in the coffin for the quarrying industry on Cape Ann, and just sporadic efforts since then. But as you all know, one door closes, another opens, and many of these quarries were later purchased by the Manships, Walker Hancock, and others, and became an artistic haven, much different from the quarrying industry that took place there. And now many of them are filled with water and surrounded by vegetation, and you would almost know it never existed. So with that, I'll bring it to a close.